In the summer humidity over Saipan, the town warmed slowly. Night bombardments had torn up broad swaths of dust. Shattered stones and powdered coral hung in the air, forming a grey-white haze in the early light. After repeated naval gunfire and aerial bombing, the shape of the streets had lost its original order. Roads were no longer roads. Walls opened outward like sawn-through bones. The scattered remnants of the Japanese naval landing forces moved among the ruins, keeping a formation that was incomplete yet still barely functional, held together by stride, hand signals, and brief bursts of movement. For them, the true threat was not the explosions in the distance, but the slipping rubble underfoot, the shifts caused by collapsing walls, and the way a single soldier's disrupted rhythm could throw the entire group off balance. At a shattered street corner, Sakamoto Kenji stopped. He took a very brief moment to read the structure of the ground. Concrete slabs, dusted with fine debris, had been cracked by residual blast force into unstable fragments that would give way under a light tap. His assessment did not pause. He redirected the lead men to move through the broken wall on the left, using the last bearing edge of its load-bearing section to keep the line of advance as stable as possible. He was accustomed to using small adjustments of his own body to carry the squad's rhythm, gauging breathing stride and sprint distance in the gaps between explosions. These details allowed the formation to maintain a short-lived structure under high pressure. The denser the shelling, the more precisely the rhythm had to be controlled. Any relaxation would throw the group out of alignment in an instant, and that loss of alignment meant they would be unable to respond to the next wave of advance. American infantry and supporting fire were driving into the urban area faster than Japanese intelligence had projected. Lines of fire stacked into an expanding net, each forward movement reaching the next block several minutes earlier than expected. Orders to hold fixed strongpoints became difficult to carry out on the shattered ground. According to the original defensive plan, each block was to have a stable point of resistance to delay the enemy's timetable, but with the blocks themselves no longer intact, holding a point simply meant staying still while fully exposed. Sakamoto understood that this disconnect could not be reversed. He no longer relied on directives. He used his physical capacity and experience to build short-range support nodes, keeping his squad's local firepower operating through several overlapping lines of movement. Between two half-collapsed walls, he set up a temporary maneuver point, positioning two riflemen to alternate watch on the mouths of the intersecting streets, ensuring that whichever side was broken into first, there would be a moment of short-range fire to slow the advance. This was all the local resistance he could still create, a method of structural control centered on his own body. He never explained his decisions in words. Habits formed in long years of training allowed him to rely only on breath rate and muscle response, reading the direction of the next explosion through the shifts in the air. Under extreme pressure, the body moved faster than thought. He could feel the squad behind him make minute adjustments in response to changes in his stride. He could sense, at the end of each sprint, whether anyone had shortened their motion out of fear. In streets like these, any fear was magnified into distortions of the overall rhythm, and a distorted rhythm meant being caught in the rolling fire of the American advance. In the Ardennes Forest, winter roads presented a completely different chaos, but a chaos just as lethal. Snow, packed down by tracked vehicles and trucks, had been pressed into deep ruts. The following cold nights froze those ruts into sharp-edged channels. German retreat vehicles, wounded soldiers, scattered supply units, and civilians fleeing the front were all crowded into the same narrow woodland pass. The markers that had once distinguished directions along the road had been torn down by shelling. Under the weight of snow, trees snapped and blocked the branches that had once been usable routes. For most units, the road network had lost all meaning. Little remained but difficult forward movement and a heightened sensitivity to the pressure of enemy fire drawing closer. Walter Grabber halted on an open patch near a holding point. He did not rely on a map. Instead, he did what he always did. He read the terrain, the tire tracks, the footprints, and the way snow had drifted under the wind, and from those details he judged the former direction of the flow of people and the current points of greatest pressure. His sensitivity to such signs was nearly instinctive. The confusion on the road did not make him hesitate. It pushed him to analyze more quickly to maintain some local order. He used breaks in the tree line and damp patches of mud to determine where armored vehicles had turned the day before, then used residual exhaust deposit around abandoned vehicles to infer how quickly the front was receding. These assessments could not change the collapse of the German retreat on any large scale, but they could create a brief, reliable sense of direction in one small sector. At a junction where snow and mud mixed, he placed makeshift markers. He used planks pried from ammunition crates, carving directional symbols on one side and an approximate time window for safe passage on the other. His hands shook continuously in the cold, but he could still draw the symbols accurately. To him, they were not language. They were structure. As long as structure existed, the flow of people would not dissolve into complete disorder. He knew that the area he influenced was insignificant compared to the entire front. He still believed that even in the midst of collapse, a route laid out with some order could reduce unnecessary losses. The cold in the Ardennes was far more corrosive than the damp air over Saipan. Vehicles cooled and froze over in a short time, ice crust forming over their hulls. Soldiers' breath froze in the night air. Supply lines were fractured by roadblocks. Many units had gone without a hot meal after dozens of hours of continuous movement. Both physical strength and reaction speed had dropped sharply. Grabber noticed that the soldiers in the retreat column had begun unconsciously shortening their stride. It was a rhythm particular to exhaustion under cold stress. He recorded the observation in a small notebook so he could analyze the speed that the flow of people could still sustain. He remained calm toward any chaos he saw, and the basis of his calm was precise reading of the structure in front of him. Saipan and the Ardennes lay thousands of miles apart, but in the same year they were both driven toward irreversible breakdown by the pressure of industrial firepower and unequal resources. On Saipan, where Sakamoto fought, the island was being lost sector by sector under overwhelming American sea and air superiority. Each bend in the defensive line brought fresh casualties and new fractures. In the Ardennes, where Grabber worked, fuel shortages and broken supply chains made it impossible even to maintain the shape of an offensive. In a few days, the counterattack shrank from an operation to a delaying action and then collapsed abruptly into a general retreat. In this double collapse, both men used their professional skills as their form of resistance. One controlled the local structure of the streets through the rhythm of his body. The other constructed temporary order in the routes through cognitive analysis. They both understood that their efforts could not change the outcome. Still, in their respective sectors, they kept a faint yet real order alive. They had no reason to stop. Order itself was how they existed. For Sakamoto, as long as he could move with precision through rubble, he could give those behind him a few more minutes to live. For Grabber, as long as he could read the pressure on the ground, he could prevent the column from disintegrating completely at some stretch of road blocked by ice and snow. Yet the weight of war always breached individual limits at some point. The fragmentation of the streets reached a state where it could no longer be corrected. The collapse of routes reached a stage where the signs were no longer legible. These irreversible changes were accumulating, pushing them toward the limits of their skill. They had not yet consciously sensed the next level of pressure, but the changes in air and terrain were quietly building a critical point, a plane of failure that no rhythm or analysis could bridge. The doctrine for defending urban blocks had been written with intact city structures in mind. It relied on static strongpoints, interlocking fields of fire, and a planned tempo of delay. Now Saipan's townscape was reduced to remnants and ribs. After bombardment, the streets looked like torn paper. Any fixed position would be completely destroyed in the next shelling. Sakamoto understood that holding in place meant being stationary, and stationary meant exposed. He had observed that the speed of the American advance was surpassing anything intelligence reports could explain. Infantry moved forward under the cover of tanks and firepower, hardly checked by the terrain. This method of advance gave the Japanese no time to reorganize their formation. The command, "Hold the block to the last man," had drifted beyond the reach of actual firepower density. He moved through the ruins, looking for fragments of structures that still allowed maneuver. Between two bomb-shattered houses, there remained a corridor less than 2 meters wide. The floor was littered with broken rebar, but the load-bearing capacity remained. He pushed the squad through quickly and set a slanted observation point at the exit so a machine gunner could provide a short burst of fire over the street ahead from a concealed angle. This was not behavior described in the regulations. It sprang from the sense of tempo formed by his years of training. He knew that each point could only hold for a few minutes under pressure. Those minutes were what the squad needed to survive. The air in the shattered district carried a mix of smells: damp, charred wood, metallic dust from shells that had not detonated, earth and blood thickening together in the stillness. Exchanges between soldiers were minimal because excess movement or speech would disturb the rhythm of their stride. Sakamoto controlled his sprint frequency by the length of his breath, keeping the unit to a minimum pattern of movement between bursts of motion and sudden halts. His hand brushed the edge of cover to confirm the ground stability. When stepping over rubble, he distributed his weight with fine precision so those following him could copy his movements. On a battlefield this broken, formations no longer obeyed the written regulations. They were defined by the body's ability to stay stable. At the same time, the road system in the Ardennes was dissolving rapidly. Routes that had once been marked on maps as main roads turned, in a few days, into clogged corridors of ice and snow. Retreating vehicles froze on inclines. Engines, pushed hard, emitted shrill metallic cracks. Soldiers from different units were mixed in the same convoys. No one could easily tell who belonged where. Artillery echoed in the distance, its sound traveling through frozen air. Each vibration shook loose more snow from the canopy, further obscuring what remained of the road's outline. At a junction, Graber repositioned his markers. The direction of the tire ruts had shifted, indicating that the leading elements of the retreat had already been forced to detour. He tapped the ground lightly with a stick to gauge the thickness of the ice, and watched how the cracks propagated to judge how much weight it could carry. He knew that these observations could postpone the moment when vehicles would jam and crush into each other. He also knew that the front line was being pushed back regardless. On the marker boards he scratched in notches for the approximate safe directions. Those marks were not meant for everyone. They were for those soldiers who still depended on structure and still looked for a path. A column of infantry stopped at one junction. Their steps were clearly unstable, their stride shortened into the rhythm characteristic of exhaustion. Graber did not go up to speak to them. He signaled toward the temporary route he had just laid out. The soldiers followed as if responding automatically, moving in the direction he indicated. He knew that his influence there was limited. They would ultimately rejoin a broader wave of disorganized retreat, but at least the section of road ahead would not become a bottleneck because they stopped. The fighting in Saipan's streets suddenly intensified. Distant tank guns and naval shell fire overlapped, and the shock waves traveled up through the broken ground. Debris shuddered in the air. Sakamoto sensed the renewed speed of the advance. He dropped the squad low and shifted them from cover on the right into a smoke-filled intersection. There stood a building not yet completely collapsed, with enough interior space to form a new short-lived maneuver point. Some parts of its inner walls remained strong enough that 2 or 3 men in the right positions could create a brief but effective crossing of fields of fire. He placed 2 soldiers behind a sloping section propped up by fallen beams, rotating them through firing positions in extremely short intervals. Every change of position required precise adjustment of their footing to avoid slipping on the fractured floor. Sakamoto himself moved at a very low profile near the entrance, ready to redirect the squad's motion in whichever direction the American advance broke into the block. His behavior went beyond anything he had been taught. It was as if he was using his body as an instrument, recalibrating his squad's reactions within the chaos. The American method of advance, however, did not change in response to Japanese precision. The zones of fire coverage continued to expand. The structure of the town grew more fragmented. The maneuver point he had just created lost its value quickly as debris fell from the side and blocked sightlines. The squad was forced to move again through increasingly irregular shells of walls. In such debris, a single misstep was enough to expose the entire group to direct fire. In the Ardennes, conditions were deteriorating as well. Roadblocks of vehicles began to form where multiple rows of trucks and armored cars pressed into each other. Engine noise drowned out distant artillery, making it harder for soldiers to gauge the pressure on the front. Many units, lacking clear orders, simply stalled. Their hesitation created chain reactions of immobility that could no longer be reversed. Graeber noticed that some soldiers were no longer able to distinguish the direction of the road. They merely let themselves be carried along by the movement of those ahead, no longer trying to read the route. His markers became less effective. The wave of retreat exceeded the scale of any local guidance. He tried to redesign routes, looking for side paths that could bypass the main road. Under the snow, he found that the soil had lost much of its strength to repeated cycles of freezing and thawing. Any vehicle that took those side paths could bog down immediately. He was left with the work of maintaining what order he could at the main junctions, keeping the retreat from collapsing completely into a standstill. He understood that this was the last layer of structure. All he could still do was delay a rupture that would inevitably come. On Saipan, a series of explosions erupted at a nearby corner. The angle of the flying debris showed that American fire was now reaching deeper positions. Sakamoto judged that the enemy infantry were now inside 100 meters. He guided the squad from a broken side alley into a narrow lane shrouded in heavy smoke. Naval shelling had gouged out depressions along this route, making it dangerous but briefly concealing. The men moved through the smoke. Unable to see the ground, their stride grew rough. Using gestures and his own motion, Sakamoto signaled them to adjust their steps, trying to reassemble the uneven footfalls into a minimal, stable rhythm. He knew that once rhythm was lost, it could not be rebuilt. The squad's survival depended on it, and the rhythm itself depended on him. The relationship lived on a heightened awareness of danger, with decisions made between breaths. In such conditions, no one could maintain perfectly correct rhythm for long. Strength, fear, and terrain would steadily eat away at control. He felt subtle changes in the tension behind him. Those changes meant the men's reserves were nearly exhausted. Night temperatures in the Ardennes continued to fall. Graeber heard the muffled sound of wheels sinking into mud beneath ice layers in the distance. He knew it signaled a retreating unit forced to stop. Stoppages required lines to be rerouted, which created new blockages. He followed the road at a slow pace, trying to locate the blockage. The cold made his thinking sluggish. Road conditions that he had once passed quickly now blurred. He strained to recognize landmarks he had once designated as reference points, and found that all shapes beneath the snow were merging into sameness. He kept his markers in place at the junctions, but his body no longer matched his former responsiveness. He found that his fingers had grown unsteady while carving symbols. His breathing lengthened, his stride shortened unconsciously. These were typical signals at the onset of hypothermia. He knew them. Knowledge did not slow the process. He lifted his head, looking for the notches on tree trunks he had once laid out as directional marks. Their shapes and cuts no longer held meaning in his mind. For a moment, he thought he had taken a wrong turn. When he looked back, the scene behind him was just as confused. He took out his small carving tool, intending to inscribe a new mark on a nearby tree to rebuild his mental model later. His fingers would no longer cooperate. The tool slipped across the bar. The symbols he carved had no structure. He stared at the tangle of lines and felt a rare, unfamiliar sensation. For the first time, he realized that his cognitive framework could no longer hold. He stopped walking, not to think, but because his body was losing the ability to go on. His legs shook slightly on the snow and ice. He tried to regulate his breathing and found that expanding his chest no longer brought clarity. The dim forest around him seemed wider than before, as though the space itself were loosening. He steadied himself against a tree and could not be sure it was a reliable support. All the clues he had relied on, terrain, noise, wind, tire tracks, were losing meaning in the extreme cold. He did not know what posture his body took when he fell. He remembered only that the frozen ground gave him a brief sense of stability, a false stability familiar to those who had lost function. In the distance, the confused columns went on moving. Footsteps and wheels rolled over the ice, a rhythm now entirely independent of him. No one noticed that he had slipped out of the line. When he regained partial consciousness, it was to the flicker of light reflected off the snow. He thought at first that some German squad had turned back. The metallic clatter that followed told him otherwise. The pitch was different from German equipment. The light approached. He saw helmets marked with white stars. The footsteps were steady, unhurried, clearly not in combat mode. An American patrol was moving through the trees, checking retreat routes for remaining enemy soldiers. By the time they found him, he could no longer stand. They first confirmed that he posed no threat. Lying in the snow, he was rolled over, his arms checked for weapons. Through the wind, he heard English, though not clearly enough to understand. They did not handle him violently. They treated him as a severely hypothermic casualty. The patrol carried him to a flatter spot and wrapped a blanket around his upper body, limiting his exposure to the air as much as possible. The difference in temperature brought him briefly back to awareness. The darkness closed in again. In Saipan's shattered streets, yet another collapse occurred along the line of retreat. A transverse beam, weakened by earlier blasts, finally came down under new pressure. Fragments rained into a narrow passage. Sakamoto was dragged into a depression behind a ruin where the ground could block part of the line of fire. His consciousness was pressed down by concussive shock, but his bodily senses were unusually sharp. He felt the changing pressure of each piece of rubble against his wounds. He sensed the imbalance in his weight distribution as he was lifted and moved. He reached out for something and found his muscles unable to form effective actions. Between bombardments, there was a short, strange silence, with dust settling slowly. During this silence, the last resistance of the squad ended. American infantry advanced along the street openings. Their equipment and footfalls held a uniform cadence, sharply distinct from the chaotic, weakened motions in the ruined block. Sakamoto was left where he lay. He could no longer act. He no longer had the strength to follow the squad's withdrawal. His body no longer possessed any combat function. Approaching American infantry conducted a cautious check. When one of them saw that he could not move, noted the heavy bleeding in his leg and the obvious concussion injuries in his chest, they treated him immediately as a casualty in need of care. Combat engineers came up behind the riflemen. They did not ask many questions. They followed the existing procedure for assessing injuries. His body trembled faintly when they turned him. The trembling was not fear. It was what remained after his internal rhythm had completely broken. For him, the hardest realization was not that he had been captured. It was that he had shifted from being the one who controlled rhythm to being an object that had to be moved according to others' rhythm. The Americans did not ask him to stand. They did not ask him to answer. They lifted him onto a stretcher and fixed him with straps to prevent further injury in transit. The motion of the stretcher caused a strange swinging sensation inside his body. He could not compensate for it. He could only endure it. In the Ardennes, Gräber was processed in the same systematic manner. Once the patrol confirmed that he could not move under his own power, they placed him in a low-impact transport category, meaning he had to be moved in a way that minimized disturbance to avoid further damage on the way to a field aid post. Blankets, stretcher, rewarming steps. Each part followed standard protocol. He was wrapped in a layer of systematized protection. That protection had no emotional warmth, but its logic was exact. At the far ends of two distant fronts, both men experienced the same condition for the first time. They ceased to be fighters and became subjects of management. Orders no longer came from military discipline. They came from a set of procedures designed to reduce death and risk. Both men slid downward through these procedures into a place they had never imagined for themselves, being handled by the enemy as lives that had to be preserved. In the moment they were lifted and carried with firm, controlled motion, their identity as soldiers fractured for the first time. Night descended slowly between the burned-out blocks of Saipan. The evening sea breeze carried the salt smell of the ocean through the piles of rubble. The air still held the residual tremors of firepower. Sakamoto Kenji was carried to an American forward aid station, an open space rapidly cleared and prepared. The lights were steady. Equipment was arranged in order. It was a segment of man-made structure embedded in chaos. Placed in the triage area, he was quickly examined. American medics, noting that he had stayed in a fighting stance for a prolonged period and resisted stubbornly along the line of advance, marked his chart in one corner, indicating priority stabilization. It was not sympathy. It was professional judgment. A soldier capable of maintaining formation in a shattered urban environment, still trying to hold rhythm after being wounded, was seen as someone with high bodily control and strong discipline. For the Americans, such a figure was to be documented, preserved, and given relatively prioritized treatment so that intelligence units at the rear could later analyze him. This institutionalized respect raised the value of his life for a moment within the system. When two engineers lifted his stretcher, their steps were even more controlled than the standard pace. The stretcher's angle was adjusted with notable care. The intent was not to comfort him. It was to avoid damaging what they regarded as a body with combat performance worth studying. Sakamoto sensed this steady rhythm. He recognized it as a different kind of precision from that of the battlefield. He was no longer simply a suppressed enemy. He was now being transported as an individual considered valuable as a combat specimen. He could not respond. He could not understand the whole reason. He knew only that he was being handled differently from ordinary prisoners. In the Ardennes, the field aid station was making similar judgments. After Graber was found by the patrol, the medical officer evaluating him examined his equipment, the wear patterns on his clothing, and the directional marks he had carved along his route. He determined that Graber was a military police tracking NCO, a man who had tried to maintain order even in a chaotic retreat. The medical staff recorded him as possessing advanced route assessment capability, consciousness to be preserved as fully as possible for later interview, and included him in a priority rewarming category. The rewarming procedure skipped no steps. It was the frequency of temperature checks that stood out as higher than that of ordinary prisoners. While wrapping him in blankets, the medics kept their movements slow and steady so as not to cause dangerous shifts in blood flow. This respect was not emotional. It was the professional acknowledgement of a soldier who had followed his function to the point of failure. As both men were transferred into larger transit camps, the American resource system came fully into play. At that point, American supply lines around the Mariana Islands were under firm control. Medical supplies, water, food, and evacuation vehicles were plentiful. In the camps, wounded prisoners received care above bare minimum standards. Those enemy soldiers who had shown high discipline and structural skill in combat were placed in specific observation groups, partly for intelligence, partly as a form of institutional recognition. In Sakamoto's ward, the ratio of nurses to patients was higher than average. His chest injuries from blast shock were assessed by an experienced surgeon. The wounds in his leg were carefully cleaned to minimize permanent loss of function. No one stated this explicitly, but the thoroughness of the work reflected clear recognition of his combat performance. With resources available, the Americans gave priority care to enemy fighters who had demonstrated professionalism. In the Ardennes, Graber was placed in a non-freezing section near a generator room to ensure his core temperature would remain stable. He was given high-calorie rations, normally reserved first for those exposed for long periods or those with high intelligence value. No one told him directly why. By watching the data on his chart regularly updated, he could see that he had been included in a higher tier of life management. The management was cool and accurate, like the maintenance granted to a delicate instrument that might still be useful. Over time, the prisoner population began to notice this difference. Many came to realize that those who had held out longest in combat and maintained some discipline amid institutional collapse were not despised by the enemy, but in some processes received more thorough care. American soldiers on duty in the camps would maintain a quiet distance from them, not a stance of hostility, but one of acknowledging that these had once been determined fighters. On Saipan, some prisoners noticed that when dressings were changed for the first time, medics adjusted the angle several times to reduce unnecessary pain. In the Ardennes, others saw Americans build a small extra shelter with a heat source for a severely wounded German soldier at night to shield him from the wind. When resources allowed, this form of priority treatment was not an accident. It was how they signaled recognition of professional character in their former opponents. The effect of this respect gradually altered the prisoners' own behavior. Japanese prisoners began to keep a line when receiving rations, having learned that order would bring better care. German prisoners gave clear accounts of their conditions at registration, realizing that detailed information would be answered with precise measures. This was not submission in the spirit of the defeated, it was an understanding, among soldiers, of another army's systemic competence. When Sakamoto tried to stand again during his recovery, a nearby American army doctor stopped for a moment, leaving his equipment aside to steady him with one arm. There was nothing intimate in the gesture. The grip was firm, the angle controlled, exactly suited to someone relearning balance. Sakamoto had never experienced this kind of almost professional parity from the other side of the battlefield. He realized that it was not pity. It was recognition of the level of control he had once had over his own body. When Graber was able to walk on his own, he was assigned to help sort some terrain records. The documents he handled were of low classification level, but their format was clear and logical, allowing him to see how another army structured its management of a battle zone. Turning the pages, he felt something unfamiliar yet deep. The enemy saw him not only as a life to be saved, but as someone who could still read structure. As time passed, this unspoken respect slowly reshaped the internal structure of the prisoner population. They no longer moved like men defeated. Within a framework of being treated as equals in some important sense, they regained a stable sense of being human. They gradually realized that an army that respected the skills of its enemies might also be one whose order could contain their continued existence. When Sakamoto could walk with slow, steady steps into a corner of the camp to stand in the sun, he no longer tried to recover the body that had set the rhythm in the streets. He understood that identity had been ended by firepower. The calm rhythm he now maintained was another kind of acknowledged existence. When Graber could sit in the pale winter sun with a new road diagram in his hands, he found that it contained no intent to inflict harm, only routes, traffic, and safety. He recognized it as a form of order he had never belonged to, but that he was willing to understand. The unit of men captured by the Americans eventually changed in a deeper way, under institutional respect, adequate resources for care, and professional acknowledgement. They turned from shattered soldiers into a group capable of accepting the structures of peace. Not because their beliefs had been argued down, but because for the first time they found that, at the far end of the fighting, the enemy could still treat them as genuine warriors and could use its resources to keep them alive.